Reality TV isn't entertainment. It's a malware download for your brain. There are phrases that pass through television like disposable confetti. And then there is the way James's father delivers London Gangster, a line so aggressively mannered it lodges in the brain like a poorly placed hook. It is not merely heard, it haunts. It returns at night, uninvited, with the energy of an out-of-touch, recently exhumed vampire wandering through perfectly ordinary dreams while everyone else on screen remains admirably committed to the far more urgent labor of serving pumptinis. The real mystery is not why it sticks, but why it was ever said like that. A theatrical, slurry affectation paired with a grimace that practically requires a close-up to complete the horror. Without the full visual, drunken confidence, tobacco-stained smile, and the sort of dental situation later corrected into veneers, the phrase loses its full grotesque artistry. This is how a single utterance becomes domestic infrastructure. It slips into morning routines as an involuntary greeting, then escalates into a household refrain that other occupants begin politely requesting be postponed until later in the day. It persists for years, a private curse with remarkable staying power, prompting the desperate search for an antidote. The most credible counter-programming comes from Aisha on Below Deck, not because the replacement is subtle, but because her vocal exuberance is so relentlessly upbeat it can overwrite almost anything through sheer exposure. The result is a peculiar but effective rehabilitation plan. Binge until the gangster phonetics dissolve into Aisha's bright sing-song cadence, then deploy that cadence on unsuspecting pets at dawn. Cats, naturally, accept the performance as their due, even when they wake their staff with a paw to the face and demand breakfast like tiny union bosses. Of course, the contagion does not stop with one line. This is how Bravo operates. It does not provide dialogue so much as it seeds catchphrases that migrate into daily speech and refuse eviction. The condition even has a name in spirit, if not in medicine. An excitable utterance syndrome in which perfectly functional adults find themselves repeating sales floor patter, melodramatic declarations, and oddly musical fragments at spouses, pets, and empty rooms. "Arabella!" becomes a random exclamation. "I confided in a friend," arrives unprompted, as though every conversation is auditioning for a reunion couch. "You can leave!" transforms into a universal command, suitable for trash bags, leftovers, and any object that has outstayed its welcome. Even inspirational phrases are not spared, but "still I rise," delivered with the wrong emphasis, becomes less empowerment than a socially inappropriate earworm, especially in environments where no one understands why it is being performed like an accusation. Then there is the darker comedic edge, the occasional admission that this spectral London gangster voice threatens to intrude at the least appropriate moments, including intimacy, concentration, or any attempt at romance requiring a modicum of dignity. The idea that a single reality TV father could sabotage adult focus is absurd on paper, which is precisely why it lands. Add the mock rituals, say the phrase into a mirror 3 times, and he appears, allegedly to announce dubious proximity to George Michael, and the phenomenon crosses from mere quoting into full superstition. A support group begins to feel less like a joke and more like a public service. Underneath the punchlines sits an unflattering character study. The voice is not merely annoying, it reads as stunted, a grown man performing adolescence with the confidence of someone who never learned to stop. That immaturity reframes everything. James is not simply difficult. He looks like the inevitable product of parents who behave like unruly peers, forcing their child into the humiliating role of emotional chaperone. It becomes hard to watch the family scenes without concluding that he never stood a chance, whether he is bragging about absurd childhood trivia or spiraling in predictable ways. The tragedy, delivered with a smirk, is that a more stable set of adults might have produced a kinder version of him. Instead, television offers a legacy, a father's grotesque little phrase, a son's damage displayed for entertainment, and an audience now unable to say, "Okay," "Pinot Grigio," or even "yellow," without hearing someone else's voice hijack the sentence midstream. That is the bargain these shows strike. Cheap spectacle in exchange for permanent residency in the cultural lexicon, rent-free forever. This reboot didn't fail because the new cast is too new. It failed because it was never made for viewers. The reboot arrives with the confidence of a coronation and the payoff of a staff meeting that should have been an email. Somewhere along the way, Alex Baskin appears to have concluded that viewers were desperate to rewind the clock and re-litigate early season workplace suspensions instead of watching the messy, long-running interpersonal chaos that made the original worth tolerating. An inspired choice, really. Take a show built on history, loyalty, betrayal, and reckless decisions, then replace it with strangers auditioning for the privilege of being remembered. The central grievance is not complicated. If the goal had been to keep the series alive, the simplest path would have been to secure more of the original cast, people the audience already knew, watched grow up, and learned to distrust in specific, lovingly documented ways. The original premise worked because it pretended to be a window into an actual ecosystem, SUR as a real workplace, real friendships, real jealousy, real desperation. That foundation mattered. Seeing someone's grim apartment or watching them scrape by made the chaos feel earned, however organically that word can be used about reality television. The reboot, by contrast, feels like a reenactment staged by people who studied the source material, memorized the beats, and forgot the inconvenient detail that authenticity cannot be hired through an agent. And yes, the irony is acknowledged. The original cast had plenty of ambition and vanity. The difference is that they did not announce it like a mission statement. Hearing reboot cast members declare, "This is my moment," and "Born to be a star," is less charismatic than it is educational, an unfiltered demonstration of how far the reality-to-influencer pipeline has evolved. Stardom used to be something a cast stumbled into while spiraling through poor decisions. Now it is treated like an entitlement package. The delusion is impressive. The star power is not. Visually, the reboot also suffers from a distinct problem. The cast reads as a single aesthetic copied and pasted with minor font changes. The original group was attractive, yes, but not interchangeable. They looked like individuals. The new group often looks like an algorithm's idea of hot, and the results are not flattering so much as vaguely unsettling. Faces smoothed, filled, tightened, and somehow aged by the very enhancements meant to preserve youth. It is the curious paradox of modern cosmetic perfection. Everyone chases the same template, then wonders why the camera can't find anyone. When viewers struggle to tell people apart, it becomes difficult to care who is betraying whom, which is generally considered a problem in a show built on betrayal. The franchise's branding has always leaned on aspirational heat. Lisa Vanderpump's curated fantasy of beautiful people behaving badly in expensive lighting. The reboot was promoted with the familiar promise that this cast is irresistibly good-looking. Then the episode aired. The disconnect was not subtle. Bragging about how many people they pull lands awkwardly when the cast's appeal is being sold as a headline feature and the audience is left searching for the headline. The atmosphere is off, the chemistry is thin, and the alleged glamour reads more like a group outing than a cultural moment. It resembles those crew night out episodes of other reality franchises, except without scenery, without authentic debauchery, and without the sense that anyone would be here if a camera were not. Underneath the casting and tone complaints sits a more damning diagnosis. The reboot tries to manufacture lightning in a bottle, while insisting the bottle was never the point. Vanderpump's role in the original success is being treated as singular and replicable. Swap in new types, keep the restaurant, and the magic returns. Yet the original worked because it was accidental alchemy, a specific staff at a specific moment, broke enough to be reckless, close enough to implode, and hungry enough to keep showing up. Attempting to recreate that with bargain bin equivalents, new Jax and Stassi, new Tom and Tom pairings, produces an imitation that is neither fresh nor satisfying. The same formula has already been tested elsewhere, including Vanderpump Villa, and the results have not exactly inspired confidence. there is also the business subtext that refuses to stay hidden. The reboot practically explains itself. Sir needs the show as much as the show needs Sir. Restaurants are struggling, nostalgia tourism has a shelf life, and the brand value of a filming location declines the moment the cultural conversation moves on. If fans are no longer motivated to pilgrimage for meh food, mediocre ambiance, and service that barely pretends to care, then a current season becomes less entertainment and more marketing strategy. That creates an unflattering tension, especially when partners and long-term stakeholders are shown as stressed, anxious, and financially exposed, while Vanderpump, with countless other ventures, can treat shenanigans as content. Even the details meant to sell bustle, like a busy night yielding tips that sound alarmingly small once divided, undercut the fantasy and make the whole operation feel less like a glamorous playground and more like a fragile business hanging on by its fingernails. Meanwhile, the franchise's own ending was already written on screen. The final reunion montage played like a curtain call, a reminder that the original run had completed its arc and the audience had made peace with it. Instead of allowing that ending to stand, or offering a proper farewell season or update special, the reboot barrels in and then has the audacity to be labeled Season 12 on streaming services. That is not continuity. It is brand laundering. If the series is truly a new show using the same set, it should at least have the decency to adopt a new title, theme, and identity, rather than stapling itself to 11 seasons of earned goodwill. Some responsibility is also assigned to the original cast's collapse. The cast was reportedly too fractured to film, refusing to engage with one another, making a functional season impossible. Sandoval's apparent desire to continue is noted, as is the sense that the network chose rebooting over a shorter, more individualized season, because social media and podcasts already provide updates. There is frustration that a satisfying send-off was sacrificed to a reset, and that certain late-season behavior, particularly from Lala, left the ensemble too broken to salvage. If the group dynamic was the point, and the group no longer existed, then the show's death was not only predictable, but arguably deserved. Not everyone rejects the reboot outright. A minority approach treats it like a substitute product, not real beef, but potentially edible if judged on its own terms. By that logic, the show does not need to match the original. It simply needs to deliver a baseline of mess in a familiar environment. There is also a reasonable argument that no restaurant-based reality series can keep pretending its cast still works there once everyone has aged out, cashed in, or moved on. A spin-off like The Valley is the logical home for veterans, and a fresh staff is the logical continuation of the original premise, at least in theory. Some viewers are willing to grant the reboot a season to find its footing, noting that even the original took time to reveal what it was. There are glimpses of potential in certain cast members, Demi, Natalie, Venus, Audrey, and a recognition that anchoring the transition with a couple established faces might have helped introduce the new ensemble before phasing the veterans out. But goodwill has limits. The dominant impression after one episode is boredom. Too many generic men floating around, a forced main character push, and not enough genuine connection to make the drama feel consequential. The reboot's attempt to recreate the old dynamic is so transparent that it becomes exhausting. It is difficult to invest in relationships that feel engineered for camera time rather than lived in, and the modern fame economy ensures everyone arrives already performing an identity optimized for attention. That shift, away from messy friends being accidentally filmed and toward ambitious strangers knowingly producing themselves, is exactly what many argue has made new reality television broadly worse. Even the franchise's familiar icons are not spared. Vanderpump's presence reads stranger here, less sharp, less commanding, and, in moments, physically altered enough to distract from what she is saying. If the reboot was meant to revive the fantasy, it is unfortunate that the fantasy now looks like it is struggling to speak clearly while scolding a staff that may not be equipped to carry the weight of an entire brand. There are, of course, scattered silver linings. Some are petty but sincere. The absence of Brock is celebrated as an unambiguous upgrade. Ariana's continued visibility outside this franchise is welcomed, proof that the original cast can thrive without being dragged back into the same loop. And if the reboot truly becomes background noise that podcast recappers can salvage with wit, that may be the most realistic path to its relevance. A show watched indirectly, consumed as commentary, and endured more as an obligation than a pleasure. Ultimately, the reboot's harshest critique is also the simplest. It is not offensive because it exists. It is disappointing because it misunderstands what the original delivered. The first run was hot, reckless, and specific. Beautiful, unhinged friends making terrible choices while the audience watched in horrified delight. The reboot is competent imitation at best and self-parody at worst, populated by people desperate to be seen and uncertain why being seen is not the same as being compelling. The franchise wanted a resurrection. What it delivered is a reminder. Lightning does not strike on command, and Season 12 does not make a sequel feel earned. Here's the part they tried to sell as inspirational. An NHL team hiring Jax Taylor for social media. Here's the part that's true. Absolutely none of it. Season 6, Episode 15 offers yet another masterclass in Jax Taylor's preferred career path. Announcing a prestigious new job, basking in the attention, and then quietly letting the storyline evaporate as though reality will politely keep up. The so-called dream hockey position is presented with all the seriousness of a life-changing professional pivot, and then, conveniently, never meaningfully mentioned again. Almost as if it was never a job. Because, of course, it was never a job. The notion that a National Hockey League franchise would hand control of an official social media department to a near 40 newcomer with no management history in branded accounts is not merely unlikely. It is structurally incompatible with how competent organizations function. Social media experience is not the ability to fire off obnoxious posts from a personal account. It is the unglamorous discipline of running a brand voice, executing campaigns, coordinating approvals, managing reputational risk, and being accountable when the internet inevitably misbehaves. Giving Jax Taylor the keys to a professional team's public-facing identity would be like hiring a foghorn to conduct a string quartet. The more credible explanation is far less cinematic and far more plausible. A short promotional appearance, a one-off gig, a request to post about the team, tag them, and provide organic reach, an arrangement designed for publicity, not payroll. Reports that the Tampa Bay Lightning effectively denied the job narrative align neatly with that reality. The interest was in promotion around an event, not installing him as the architect of a franchise's digital strategy. If there was any role at all, it reads like intern-level duties inflated into executive mythology. Because exaggeration is not an accident here, it is a brand. And the embellishments keep pace with whatever nearby storyline is earning attention. Tack on events, because event planning is suddenly in the orbit. Borrow the language of career legitimacy because someone else is receiving real opportunities, and weaponize the announcement as leverage in a relationship. That leverage is the point. The hockey fantasy functions as a 2-for-1, a convenient attempt to shake Britney loose, and a reliable method for reclaiming the spotlight when others are advancing. When Lisa Vanderpump offered the Toms their sliver of ownership, and the Tom momentum began, the timing of Jax's spiral was not subtle. This is a man who has openly demonstrated a need to be noticed, and when attention shifts away, the response is not growth, it is escalation. The hockey job becomes a dramatic exit threat, designed to trigger panic, devotion, or at minimum, a room full of concerned faces asking questions about his future. The problem, as always, is that the people around him sometimes take the performance at face value, including the inconvenient possibility that Britney might actually consider uprooting her life to follow him, forcing a rapid pivot back to staying put once the bluff risks becoming real. Even the Florida details carry the familiar scent of scorched earth and reinvention. There is long-standing talk that bridges were burned, that returning would not be as seamless as the storyline suggests, and that his identity shift, Jason Cauchi rebranding into Jax Taylor upon leaving Florida, fits the pattern of fleeing consequences and rewriting the narrative. If any offer existed in the Tampa area, the most realistic version would be something mundane and local, not a coveted role at one of the league's better-run organizations. And the practical objection remains undefeated. Someone who cannot reliably show up on time to tend bar is not suddenly a trustworthy steward of a professional sports franchise's public image. The final insult is that the premise requires believing he views sports social media as little more than posting a photo and the score, an attitude that perfectly captures why the job never existed outside the thin air of his own self-mythology. This isn't a reboot, it's CPR, performed on SIR, on camera, in real time. The clearest message in this supposedly fresh chapter is not the new faces or recycled drama. It is the quiet panic that SIR is drifting toward the same fate as countless nearby restaurants that did not come with a built-in television subsidy. Whatever romantic mythology exists about the restaurant has always been secondary to the real asset, the show. That exposure is not a cute bonus or a competitive edge in the way a better menu would be. It is the life support system, with fan tourism doing the heavy lifting while the broader West Hollywood dining scene carries on without needing a camera crew to justify its rent. And yes, that is precisely why this reboot exists. Extracting more value from the brand is a safer bet than chasing relevance in some suburban shopping mall fantasy. The new cast, at least, offers one reassuring detail. Several were actual SIR employees before the announcement, including one fleetingly visible in old footage. Proof that this is not entirely a casting call fever dream. Even better, the production lucked into an early off-duty misadventure that bled directly into filming, complete with parents on site, which reads less like strategy and more like a genuinely inconvenient reality. In other words, there is at least a pulse. Unfortunately, the show immediately undercuts that authenticity by leaning into a heavily manufactured reality persona energy, everyone performing an outline of what they believe this series is supposed to be, as if reciting from the original template and expecting applause for accuracy. The result feels conspicuously produced, conspicuously familiar, and conspicuously unaware that audiences are capable of recognizing a rerun even when it is wearing a new name tag. The Kristen and Stassi echoes, the Jax and James impressions, the Schwartz-adjacent presence, and the insistence that viewers should not compare the reboot to the original, while the premiere begs for the comparison. A network cannot demand novelty and nostalgia simultaneously, and then scold the audience for noticing the contradiction. If a fresh start is the goal, filling the first episode with the same cast types and storylines is an odd way to demonstrate it. The smarter play, creatively and commercially, would have been pivoting to the busier Las Vegas restaurants, where the backdrop is inherently more dynamic and the series could evolve rather than cosplay its own past. Instead, the fixation on keeping SIR alive reads partly as loyalty, possibly shaped by long-standing partnerships, and partly as pure financial triage, keeping the doors open as long as feasible, because in this economy, mediocre, overpriced food and indifferent service do not get infinite chances just because the wallpaper once photographed well. A television show can attract tourists. It cannot, on its own, repair a business that refuses to adapt. Locals are not avoiding the neighborhood. They are avoiding the venue. West Hollywood is thriving, and nearby restaurants remain packed. Even within the immediate orbit, Tom Tom is routinely busier than SIR, and other well-regarded spots in the area do not require fandom to function. This is why the locals do not go anywhere around their defense collapses on contact with reality. They go elsewhere, often. Operational choices do not help either. Restricting drink-only patrons to a tiny bar area and effectively telling others to order food or leave is a remarkable way to sabotage the highest margin part of the business, especially when liquor sales typically keep restaurants afloat. Dressing that up as it is a restaurant, not a bar, may sound principled, but it is still self-inflicted bleeding. Add in a venue that looks increasingly dingy and dated, especially ironic given the stated devotion to ambiance over food, and the rescue mission starts to look less like brand stewardship and more like a slow-motion negotiation with inevitability. Viewers may warm up to the new crew over time. Some will never bother. A modest extension of the franchise's lifespan is plausible, perhaps even a couple of seasons, provided the surrounding economic realities do not finish what comp. Lacency started. The more pessimistic forecast is equally straightforward. Initial curiosity, a split audience, reluctant sampling by longtime fans, and then the familiar second-season complaint cycle about how it is not the original, because the reboot insists on reenacting the original while demanding to be judged as something else. Somewhere in all of this, the most honest moment may be the faint sense of apology hovering over the exercise, an unspoken acknowledgement that this is what saving Essure looks like now. Less a triumphant reinvention than a calculated attempt to keep a fading institution upright, one carefully staged, authentic scene at a time. Sur isn't a restaurant anymore. It's a set that happens to serve food, badly, and somehow expects applause for the privilege. Sur's continued existence now feels less like a business plan and more like a social experiment. How long can a restaurant survive when its defining brand promise is televised dysfunction and its day-to-day product is indifference? The premise is simple. Customers are expected to spend real money in exchange for service that, by numerous accounts, looks suspiciously like a staff meeting that never ended. Drinking on the job, lingering aimlessly, shouting across the room, and performing interpersonal chaos with the confidence of people who believe accountability is optional. Trusting that environment with food requires either impressive optimism or a truly committed relationship with the concept of risk. The financial strain is not exactly subtle. Comments about workers splitting a few $100s across a full server team are not the kind of detail that signals a thriving dining room. On-screen acknowledgments of struggling land less like storyline spice and more like a reluctant confession. The restaurant itself is repeatedly described as tired, dusty, run-down, dated, and curiously reminiscent of artificial decor preserved long past the point of charm. In a city where competition is ruthless and rent is real, mediocre but famous is not a durable category. It survives until it doesn't. The show, of course, is the life support machine. A new season reads as a last-second attempt to inject relevance and foot traffic back into a place that used to be packed and is now often empty when cameras are not involved. Filming days change the atmosphere, but not necessarily for the better. On the contrary, production reportedly turns the bar into a waiting room for beverages that exist primarily as props. Multiple takes, endless remakes, drinks made and discarded for continuity, and customers left to stare at the spectacle while waiting an absurd length of time for signature cocktails. Nothing says hospitality quite like watching waste happen in real time while being told to remain patient. Then there's the deliberate discouragement of comfort, like miniature bar seating apparently designed to prevent anyone from lingering long enough to notice the cracks. It is an oddly fitting metaphor for the broader strategy. Keep people moving, keep them distracted, keep them from expecting too much. And yet, even amid the dysfunction, the menu still manages to produce the occasional bright spot. The goat cheese balls reliably draw praise. The lasagna has defenders. And when the food lands, it can feel like a surprising reminder that this is technically still a restaurant and not merely a set with appetizers. Pricing, however, is where the fantasy really commits to its own destruction. $30 drinks and checks that balloon after a handful of cocktails are harder to justify when the drinks are described as weak, overly sweet, or simply not worth the premium. Tourist trap is a recurring verdict, and it tends to arrive alongside the classic warning sign of decline. Quality goes down while prices go up. That combination does not build loyalty. It builds one-time visitors and cautionary tales. Even the more generous experiences often carry an asterisk. Service is pleasant when cameras are absent, staff can be warm and attentive, and certain faces make guests feel welcome. The problem is consistency. A reputation cannot run on great unless it's filming, or busy, or inconvenient, or any normal condition a restaurant should handle. The demographic shift explains the fragility. Sur appears increasingly fueled by tourists and fans who come for the lore, to witness the yelling, the loitering, the theatrical friction, and possibly the chance of being near a scene. Locals are widely portrayed as uninterested, and the notion that residents treat it as a serious dining destination strains credulity. Without the original cast, who built the hype over many seasons and made the place feel like a living extension of the show, the draw becomes thinner, more novelty-based, and therefore more temporary. A reboot may create curiosity, but curiosity rarely pays rent for long unless the product improves. Meanwhile, the broader economic context is doing the restaurant no favors. Eating out has become an extravagance for many. Wages have not kept pace with the price of a basic night out, and the nightlife and restaurant industries are widely described as suffering across markets. That reality makes expensive mediocrity an especially bold position. Even guests who find the food tasty describe leaving underfed or unimpressed, hardly the emotional finale a high-priced West Hollywood institution should aim for. This is why suggestions for Sewer's future increasingly sound like eulogies dressed as ideas. If the restaurant is no longer a sleek destination, but a nostalgia site, then perhaps the honest move is to stop pretending otherwise. Turn it into a museum of reality television history. Convert it into immersive dinner theater where being in on the action is the point, and the chaos is at least openly choreographed. Lean into kitsch and stop forcing serious restaurant optics onto a business model that is now largely dependent on spectatorship. There is also the more cynical interpretation. Keeping Esser alive as a filming hub conveniently reframes expenses as production costs, advertising, and branding. An arrangement that can function as a financial cushion even when the dining room underperforms, while still serving as a distribution channel for other products tied to the brand. The irony is that squeezing the last drops of publicity out of a fading institution may be exactly what accelerates the fade, because the restaurant becomes trapped as a set piece rather than allowed to evolve into something genuinely competitive. And hovering over all of this is the cultural critique of West Hollywood itself, an area some argue has changed dramatically since the pandemic, and one that others accuse reality television of reshaping into a tourist-friendly stage at the expense of the neighborhood's original character, including its LGBTQ nightlife ecosystem. The counterpoint is immediate. Employment and representation are cited as evidence against the harshest accusations. What remains undeniable is that the brand's gravitational pull has redirected the space toward transient consumption. Visitors arriving to experience a televised myth, not to invest in a local institution. Sewer may limp along as long as fandom remains a renewable resource and Bravo's cameras keep the lights flattering. But as a restaurant competing on food, service, and value, it is currently being reviewed like a cautionary case study. The concept still sells. The execution, far too often, behaves as if customers should feel honored merely to be present. That is not a strategy. That is a countdown with good lighting. If you're looking for the worst man on this show, brace yourself. The answer is not a personality debate. It's a threat assessment. Choosing the worst man on Vanderpump Rules is less a debate than an inventory exercise. Misogyny, dishonesty, weaponized incompetence, and occasional violence rotate through this cast like a seasonal cocktail menu. The only real question is whether the title goes to the one who behaves badly in plain daylight, the one who does it with a grin and a shrug, or the one who has turned plausible deniability into a lifestyle brand. Jax Taylor makes an aggressively persuasive case for himself, not because subtlety is his strength, quite the opposite, but because the pattern is so loud it practically narrates its own true crime podcast. He has been accused of domestic violence, including incidents described as escalating rage with a child nearby, which is a chilling detail in any context and a catastrophic one in a household. Add in prior allegations, repeated law enforcement contact that is notably unusual for someone with extensive privilege, and the picture shifts from reality TV villain to genuine risk factor. There is a reason he triggers capable of murder language and family annihilator comparisons. The behavior described is not merely cruel, it is volatile. Even the non-violent resume is grotesque. Serial cheating, compulsive lying, reckless sexual conduct, including refusing condoms and claims of spreading an incurable STD, and the now immortal detail of having sex with Faith in the presence of an elderly, disabled woman. It is difficult to engineer a more concentrated display of contempt for boundaries, dignity, and basic humanity. But credit is due. Effort was clearly made. James Kennedy is the only contender who can realistically challenge Jax for the top slot, because the alleged conduct attributed to him blends intimidation with repetition. Multiple partners, Kristen, Rachel, Raquel, and Allie, are cited in accusations of physical and verbal abuse, with references to a domestic violence record, public incidents, and a temperament that rarely appears capable of a conversation without tears, shouting, and misogynist obscenities. The list expands beyond partner abuse into a broader pattern: sexually harassing a waitress, humiliating women, including fat-shaming Katie, and treating girlfriends as trophies and targets rather than people. There's also the bonus feature of performative bravado, posturing when women are the easiest audience, and shrinking when confronted by men who can physically dominate him. The most damning element, however, is not the volatility. It is the way volatility gets repackaged into entertainment. A quick insult in a confessional, a timely alliance during a scandal, and suddenly the same behavior is treated like a character arc instead of a threat assessment. Then comes Tom Schwartz, the patron saint of aw shucks cruelty, soft-voiced, downcast eyes, and just enough helplessness to make enablers feel charitable. This is precisely why he lands so high in many rankings. The harm is delivered with a smile and an insistence that nothing was meant by it. He has been described as persistently misogynistic, routinely dismissive of women, reflexively protective of men no matter what they do, and disturbingly comfortable humiliating his partner in public while maintaining the costume of the harmless nice guy. The record cited includes cheating, pouring a drink over Katie's head, kicking in a door after a bender, and putting hands on women during chaotic moments, behavior that reads less like oops and more like a man testing how much aggression can be televised and still be dismissed as a joke. The emotional abuse is framed as insidious for a reason. It is slow, plausible, and designed to leave the target looking reactive while the perpetrator looks bewildered. It is also why arguments erupt over whether he is worse than the men with clearer violence allegations. Physical danger is not the only danger. Sustained degradation can be its own kind of damage, and Schwartz specializes in the kind that looks funny at reunions. Tom Sandoval, in this particular contest, functions as the bleak punchline. The cast is so foul that the manipulative liar with a well-documented appetite for betrayal can be described as least bad by comparison. The claim is not that he is harmless, only that he lacks the same public track record of physical aggression attributed to Jax and James. What he offers instead is the quieter portfolio, emotional manipulation, calculated deceit, and the kind of behind-the-scenes engineering that makes chaos look accidental. Ironically, he has absorbed some of the loudest public hatred, which says less about moral clarity and more about how easily audiences confuse humiliation in a headline with danger in a living room. Beyond the core four, other names surface as honorary mentions in the Hall of Shame. Brock is referenced alongside credible accusations and reports of partner violence. Randall is invoked with the implication that publicly known details barely scratch the surface. Patrick and Frank appear as additional examples of men who were bad enough in limited screen time to remain memorable. Even production figures get dragged into the conversation, because when the environment rewards cruelty, the architects do not escape notice. There is also an uncomfortable but necessary point about selective outrage. When viewers dislike a victim, abuse becomes complicated, and when a perpetrator is witty at the right moment, abuse becomes messy. That is not feminism, it is fandom with a halo. So, who is the definitive worst? If the metric is overt danger, escalation, and credible allegations involving domestic violence, especially with a child in proximity, Jack sits at the top with grim confidence, If the metric is repeated abusive behavior paired with social camouflage and strategic charm, James is a close second, and, to some, the more frightening because he can still be excused as entertaining. If the metric is psychological erosion wrapped in faux innocence, Schwartz earns his place as the cast's most polished saboteur, and Sandoval, astonishingly, ends up where this cast forces him. Not exonerated, merely outclassed by men who have made villainy look like a full-time profession. The only truly consistent conclusion is that the bar is not low. It is subterranean, and the cast keeps digging. The most insulting thing about this reboot isn't that it's bad. It's that it thinks you're too nostalgic to realize it's empty. 20 minutes into the new season, the unsettling realization arrives. If production quietly swapped every cast member with complete strangers, new faces, new names, no resemblance whatsoever, there would be no way to tell. That is not a compliment. That is a sign the show has achieved the rare feat of feeling both manufactured and indistinguishable, like a reality series assembled from spare parts. The reboot's central problem is obvious. It wants to be the original without earning the original's chaos. Cameras roll, and everyone performs as if auditioning for classic cast energy, except none of them can act, and the drama they're trying to sell is so flimsy it doubles as a sleep aid. This is imitation television. The gestures are familiar, the delivery is atrocious, and the result is an echo without a pulse. Natalie, meanwhile, appears determined to win the season's least tolerable award in record time. The presentation is a masterclass in self-importance wrapped in fragility, finished with a glossy victimhood complex. The show tries to make her compelling, but the only thing truly consistent is how quickly she drains oxygen from every scene. The drama orbiting her isn't intense, it's tedious. It's not scandal, it's paperwork. Marcus lands in a different category, less instant contempt, more baffled fascination. The budget model, honesty, is the closest thing to a human moment the premiere manages, and it briefly works, until the rest of the persona kicks in. The overall impression is forced, dull, and not especially sharp. Still, compared to the cast's general blankness, even a slightly awkward try-hard can read as carrying. That is how low the bar has been set. Kim is positioned as part of a prefabricated trio dynamic that seems designed to evoke familiar archetypes. The resemblance to earlier cast configurations isn't subtle. It's practically a reenactment. There's a creeping sense that the casting brief was younger versions of the originals, as if the audience wouldn't notice the difference between lightning and a battery-powered candle. And then there's Shane, not elite, not particularly distinctive, but clearly the one being framed as the standout. Loud personality, obvious douche undertones, shameless attention-seeking. At least it's a discernible flavor. Forced, yes, but openly so, which perversely makes it more watchable. Reality TV does not require virtue. It requires nerve. He has some. Most of the others have none. A larger structural issue hangs over the season. Modern reality casts increasingly fall into three buckets: carefully curated influencer types, shameless attention seekers, and normal people with minimal personality. This group leans heavily toward the first and the third. The result is a cast that may be perfectly pleasant in real life, potentially even decent friends, but on screen feels like nice background people, accidentally promoted to main characters. Predictably, the appearance discourse shows up immediately, because of course it does. There's a difference between calling people ugly and acknowledging a cast lacks striking presence. The critique here isn't that everyone is hideous, it's that most are visually and energetically indistinct. Pretty blah in a franchise that once relied on sharply defined personalities and memorable faces. Glam and styling are also typically weaker early on, before the money hits, but that explanation only goes so far when the bigger problem is that nobody feels like an event. Venus gets singled out as an exception, someone with noticeable beauty and at least a hint of uniqueness, and for some, the only person who consistently holds attention. Even her singing, though, sparks the predictable split. Maybe versus absolutely not. The setting doesn't help. Sir, once a character in its own right, now reads like a tired set piece, shabby, dated, and oddly hollow. It looks less like a buzzing workplace and more like a theme park version of itself, an attraction for nostalgic adults who want the memory of 2013, not the reality of 2005. Even the food shots aren't doing the place favors. The lasagna looks so dry it could be used as packing material. When the restaurant feels dead, the show feels smaller. And when the show feels smaller, the reboot feels cheaper. The comparison problem is unavoidable, and the production seems determined to provoke it. Keeping the same venue and branding without a full reset invites constant side-by-side judgment. Many voices insist the solution was obvious. New name, new theme song, new restaurant, a clean break. Without that, the season becomes a weekly exercise in measuring newcomers against an original cast that felt lightning in a bottle, messy, magnetic, and impossible to replicate by formula. There's also a blunt generational fatigue running through the reaction. The drama feels childish, babyfied, and not even malicious enough to be thrilling, just plastic and dull. Some tastes have shifted toward competition formats and away from rich people bickering and petty implosions, making this style of messy youth drama harder to tolerate with age and real-life perspective. The irony is that the reboot is trying to return to square one: young people, service industry proximity, desperation-driven choices, yet it still feels like cosplay rather than necessity. Not everyone despises it. Some find it entertaining enough to keep watching, on the grounds that early seasons are often rough and franchises frequently take time to find their stride. The argument goes that the original wasn't universally beloved from frame one either, and weekly viewing versus binging changes perception. There's also the eternal truth. Plenty of people will continue watching out of habit, spite, or simple loyalty, because disliking episode 1 has never stopped anyone from committing to an entire season of questionable television. But the most damning critique is also the simplest. The premiere feels low effort. Casting does not look extra hard. Production feels complacent. The ensemble seems overstuffed, as if the show couldn't decide who matters, leaving 3-4 people who add nothing but screen time. The men, especially, come off as decorative, boring, present largely for aesthetics, and still failing to deliver even that reliably. The vibe is wannabe, chasing the fame the original stumbled into before anyone knew what the show would become. At the center of it all sits a franchise ego problem: the belief that people are interchangeable, that a brand can be rebooted by swapping faces and reusing a location. That kind of confidence reads less like creative vision and more like narcissism, an assumption that the audience will accept a replacement cast simply because the sign outside still matches the title card. The original succeeded because it wasn't engineered to be iconic. It just was. This version is engineered to resemble iconography, and that is not the same thing. So yes, it may improve. It may even become watchable in a fine whatever way. But as it stands, it's not the show it insists on being. It's a reboot that wants credit for history without producing anything remotely historic, and expects applause for remembering its own name. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes it's not discrimination. Sometimes people just don't like you. Season 7, Episode 7 plays like a masterclass in people arguing about everything except the actual issue. And Billie Lee positions herself at the center of it with the dedication of someone auditioning for lead role in a misunderstanding. What begins as Katie planning an event with the radical premise of inviting people she actually likes is promptly repackaged into an oppression narrative, an impressive sprint from annoyed about not being included to everyone here is transphobic, with all the subtlety of a siren. The crowning moment is the line about pulling the trans card in response to a fat card, delivered as though it is a triumphant moral thesis rather than a breathtaking category error. Body shaming is not an identity, and treating it like a bargaining chip next to someone's lived reality is not a mic drop. It is a cell phone performed at full volume. Even more remarkable is that this grand speech is mounted while defending James, a man who seems to treat insulting women's bodies as a personality trait, punctuated by predictable tears and the occasional delusion of musical genius, while quietly continuing his habitual cheating. Katie's frustration is not mysterious. Being insulted at work by a coworker who cannot control his mouth is not a storyline. It is an occupational hazard. Yet the episode insists on detouring into a trans rights tribunal over what is,